The marble floors of Sterling Industries headquarters gleamed under the morning sun as Victoria Hayes rushed through the revolving doors, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching her phone. 6 months pregnant and still trying to reach her husband, she felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to break through her carefully maintained composure. Christopher Sterling hadn't answered any of her calls that morning. 17 attempts, each one sent straight to voicemail. Victoria paused in the vast lobby, catching her reflection in the polished steel panels. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent alone in their penthouse. The baby had been particularly active, kicking with an urgency that seemed almost like a message. She'd wanted to share that moment with Christopher, to feel his hand on her stomach, to see his face light up the way it used to when they first learned they were expecting. But those moments had become increasingly rare, as his business empire demanded more of his attention. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, looked up with sympathetic eyes. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm afraid Mr. Sterling is in back-to-back meetings all day. He specifically requested no interruptions, even from his wife." Victoria's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion she fought to contain. Ashley shifted uncomfortably. "Those were his instructions, ma'am. The Japanese investors are here for the merger talks and I understand." Victoria cut her off gently, not wanting to make the woman's position more difficult. She understood all too well. The merger had consumed Christopher for months, turning the man she married into a stranger who lived in the same house but existed in a completely different world. Walking back toward the parking garage, Victoria felt a sharp twinge in her abdomen. She stopped, breathing through it, telling herself it was just Braxton Hicks' contractions. Her doctor had warned her about stress, about the importance of staying calm. But how could she stay calm when her marriage was crumbling and her husband seemed more interested in quarterly reports than the life they'd created together? Christopher Sterling sat in his glass-walled office on the 42nd floor, his phone face down on the mahogany desk. He'd seen Victoria's name flash across the screen multiple times, each call a reminder of the guilt that gnawed at him. But he couldn't afford distractions today. The merger with Tanaka Corporation represented everything he'd worked for, a deal worth $3 billion that would cement Sterling Industries as a global powerhouse. "Mr. Sterling, the Tanaka representatives are ready in the boardroom," his assistant Marcus announced from the doorway. Christopher stood, buttoning his suit jacket, pushing thoughts of Victoria to the back of his mind. He'd make it up to her later, he always did. Perhaps a weekend in the Hamptons, or that diamond bracelet she'd admired. He'd learned early in their marriage that grand gestures could smooth over his absences, though lately he'd noticed Victoria's smiles didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. The meeting stretched for hours, a complex dance of negotiations and strategic positioning. Christopher was in his element, commanding the room with the confidence that had built his fortune from a small startup to an empire. He barely registered the vibration of his phone in his pocket, silencing it without looking. Victoria sat in her car in the parking garage, her hands trembling as she dialed her obstetrician's office. The pains had grown sharper, more frequent. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, but she didn't want to be that paranoid first-time mother who rushed to the hospital for every twinge. "Dr. Morrison's office, this is Brenda speaking. This is Victoria Sterling. I'm having some concerning symptoms, and I can't reach my husband. Should I come in?" The nurse's voice shifted to professional concern. "What kind of symptoms, Mrs. Sterling?" As Victoria described the pains, the unusual pressure, the feeling that something had changed in the baby's movements, Brenda's responses became increasingly urgent. "Mrs. Sterling, I need you to go to the hospital immediately. Don't drive yourself. Can someone take you?" Victoria looked around the empty garage, her phone still showing Christopher's unanswered calls. "I'll manage," she whispered, starting the engine with shaking hands. At Sterling Industries, Christopher finally emerged from the boardroom at 6 p.m., exhausted but triumphant. The deal was progressing better than expected. Marcus met him with a tablet full of emails requiring immediate attention, and Christopher dove into them without hesitation, walking toward his office while scrolling through contracts and financial projections. "Sir, your wife called the office multiple times today," Marcus mentioned carefully. "Ashley said she seemed quite distressed." Christopher waved dismissively. "She's probably upset I missed another prenatal appointment. Add it to the calendar. I'll make the next one." He didn't notice Marcus's troubled expression or the way his assistant opened his mouth as if to say more, then thought better of it. The baby's kicks had changed. Victoria noticed it as she drove, one hand on the wheel, the other pressed against her belly. The vigorous movements from the morning had softened, become almost gentle, as if her child was conserving energy, or saying goodbye. The thought struck her with such force that she nearly swerved into the next lane. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please hold on. Mommy's getting help." The hospital emergency entrance loomed ahead, and Victoria felt relief flood through her. Within minutes, she was on a gurney surrounded by nurses and doctors, all moving with practiced urgency. Monitors were attached, IV lines inserted, questions asked and answered in a blur. "We need to contact your husband," a nurse said gently, holding Victoria's phone. "What's the code?" Victoria recited the numbers, watching as the nurse scrolled through the call log. 17 missed calls to Christopher, 3 to her mother who was traveling in Europe, 2 to her best friend Jennifer who hadn't answered. The loneliness of that list hit her harder than any physical pain. Dr. Morrison arrived, her face grave as she studied the monitors. "Victoria, the baby's heart rate is concerning. We're going to need to operate immediately. We need your consent, and we need to reach your husband." "He's in meetings," Victoria said automatically, the excuse so familiar it felt like a script. Then, feeling the weight of the moment, she added, "Do what you need to do. Save my baby. Please." As the medical team prepared for emergency surgery, a nurse dialed Christopher's number again. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. In his office, Christopher had placed his phone in his desk drawer, determined to finish the merger documents without interruption. The sound of his wife's desperation was muffled by mahogany and ambition, unheard and unanswered. The operating room lights blazed with clinical intensity as Dr. Morrison made the first incision. Victoria lay conscious but sedated, her eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles, counting them as a way to anchor herself to reality. 23 tiles, she noted. 23 squares between her and the life she'd imagined for this moment. Christopher was supposed to be here, holding her hand, whispering reassurances. Instead, a kind nurse named Patricia squeezed her fingers, a stranger offering comfort that should have come from her husband. "You're doing beautifully, Victoria," Dr. Morrison said, her voice steady despite the tension that filled the room. "Just a few more minutes." But Victoria could read the worry in the exchange of glances between the surgical team, the quickening pace of their movements, the monitors beeping that seemed to pulse with increasing urgency. She'd spent 6 months reading every pregnancy book, attending every class Christopher had been too busy to join, and she knew enough to recognize when something was desperately wrong. At Sterling Industries, the celebration had begun. Christopher popped open a bottle of champagne, Cristal Vintage 2015, and poured glasses for the Tanaka executives and his senior team. The merger papers bore fresh signatures, and his company's valuation had just increased by 40%. It was the triumph of his career, the culmination of 18-hour days and sacrificed weekends. He thought briefly of Victoria, making a mental note to bring home champagne for her too, the non-alcoholic kind she'd been drinking since the pregnancy began, to new partnerships and global expansion. Christopher raised his glass, his smile broad and genuine. Around him his team cheered, their faces flushed with victory. Marcus stood at the back of the room, his expression oddly somber, his own glass untouched. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus approached as the celebration continued around them. "Sir, I really think you should check your phone. There have been multiple calls from—" "Marcus," Christopher's tone carried warning, "not tonight. Whatever it is can wait until morning. Tonight we celebrate." He clapped his assistant on the shoulder, missing the concern that deepened in Marcus's eyes. The baby emerged silent. That was the first sign that shattered Victoria's already fragile composure. Every mother knows that silence in a delivery room is the worst sound of all. She tried to lift her head to see, but the surgical drape blocked her view. "The baby," she gasped. "We're working on it, Doctor." Morrison's voice remained calm, but Victoria heard the strain beneath it. "The neonatal team is here." Victoria hadn't even known if she was having a boy or girl. She and Christopher had wanted it to be a surprise, something to discover together in a moment of shared joy. Now medical staff surrounded a warming table where her child lay, their bodies blocking her view, their urgent murmurs creating a soundtrack of terror. Time became elastic, stretching and contracting. Seconds felt like hours as Victoria strained to hear a cry, a whimper, any sound of life. Then, finally, a weak mewl broke through the clinical sounds of the operating room. Relief crashed over her so intensely she sobbed, her tears mixing with the sweat on her face. "It's a girl," Patricia whispered near her ear, squeezing her hand tighter. "A beautiful baby girl. Will she?" Victoria couldn't form the complete question, terror strangling her words. "Doctor..." Morrison appeared in her line of sight, her mask pulled down, her expression carefully neutral. "Victoria, your daughter is alive, but she's very fragile. She's being transferred to the neonatal intensive care unit immediately. Her oxygen levels are critically low, and there are complications we need to address urgently." "I need Christopher," Victoria whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "Please. Someone needs to make him understand. He needs to be here." A hospital administrator, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner, took Victoria's phone. "I'll reach him, Mrs. Sterling. I promise you. We'll get him here." Christopher's phone finally emerged from the drawer at 9 p.m. when he returned to his office to collect his briefcase. The screen lit up with a cascade of notifications: 43 missed calls, 62 text messages, 12 voicemails. His stomach dropped as he saw the progression. Victoria's name, then the hospital, then numbers he didn't recognize, all spanning the last 6 hours. His hands shook as he opened the most recent voicemail from a number identified as Mercy General Hospital. "Mr. Sterling, this is Administrator Helen Rodriguez from Mercy General. Your wife, Victoria Sterling, underwent emergency surgery this evening. Your daughter was born at 6:47 p.m. and is currently in critical condition in our neonatal intensive care unit. We need you here immediately. Please call this number as soon as you receive this message." The words hit him like physical blows. Surgery, daughter, critical condition. The champagne he'd consumed turned to acid in his stomach. His daughter. He had a daughter, and she was dying, and he hadn't been there. He hadn't answered. He'd chosen a business deal over his wife's desperate calls, and now... "Marcus!" Christopher's voice cracked as he shouted for his assistant. "Get the car. Now. Mercy General Hospital." The drive across the city took 23 minutes, but it felt like crossing an endless desert. Christopher sat in the back of his town car, calling the hospital repeatedly, being transferred between departments, each transfer another twist of the knife in his chest. Finally, he reached the NICU and heard words that made his blood run cold. "Your daughter's condition is extremely critical, Mr. Sterling. The next few hours are crucial. Your wife has been asking for you. She's in recovery room 304. He found Victoria in a private room, pale as the sheets she lay upon, an IV in her arm, her eyes closed. For a terrible moment, he thought he was too late, that he'd lost her too. Then her eyes opened, and the look she gave him was worse than any nightmare he'd ever had. "Christopher." His name came out flat, emotionless, as if she'd used up all her feeling and had nothing left. "Victoria, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. The meetings? I had my phone off. The excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Our daughter is dying," Victoria interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She has severe complications from oxygen deprivation. They don't know if she'll make it through the night." She paused, and when she spoke again, each word was carefully enunciated, as if she was explaining something to a child. "I called you 17 times this morning because I knew something was wrong. I felt it. Mothers know these things, but you couldn't be bothered to answer. Victoria, please." "Her name is Grace," Victoria continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "I named her while they were trying to save her life, while you were celebrating your merger with Champagne. Grace Sterling, in case you wanted to know what to put on the birth announcement, or perhaps the other kind of announcement if she doesn't survive." The cruelty of her words, so unlike the gentle, understanding woman he'd married, told him more than anything else how deeply he'd wounded her. This wasn't the Victoria who'd made excuses for his absences, who'd smiled through disappointment, who'd convinced herself that his ambition was something to admire rather than fear. A nurse entered, her timing both interrupting and saving him. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, the doctor wants to speak with you both. It's about Grace." They followed her in silence, Victoria in a wheelchair despite her protests that she could walk. Christopher walked beside her, afraid to touch her, afraid that any gesture would be rejected. The neonatal intensive care unit was a forest of machines and incubators, each one holding a tiny, fragile life. The nurse led them to an incubator in the corner, and Christopher's breath caught in his throat. Inside lay the smallest human being he'd ever seen, covered in tubes and wires, her chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. His daughter, Grace. The reality of her, the physical proof of what his absence had cost, brought him to his knees beside the incubator. Dr. Morrison approached, a tablet in her hands, her expression grave. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, I need to be completely honest with you about Grace's condition and what we're facing in the next 48 hours. Dr. Morrison pulled up 2 chairs, waiting until both Christopher and Victoria were seated before she began. The steady beep of Grace's monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to words that would change everything. Grace was deprived of oxygen for an extended period before and during delivery, Dr. Morrison explained, her voice gentle but unflinching. We've stabilized her for now, but she has a condition called persistent pulmonary hypertension. Essentially, her lungs aren't adapting to breathing air the way they should. We have her on a ventilator and specialized medications, but the next 2 days will determine her trajectory. Christopher's hand moved instinctively toward Victoria's, but she pulled away, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. The small rejection cut deeper than any business failure ever had. What are her chances? Victoria asked, her voice hollow. If she makes it through the next 48 hours and shows improvement, her odds increase significantly. Right now, I'd estimate 60-40. Dr. Morrison paused, letting the weight of those odds settle. But I want you both to understand, even if she survives, we won't know the extent of any neurological impact for some time. After Dr. Morrison left, Christopher and Victoria sat in silence, watching their daughter fight for life. Finally, Christopher spoke, his voice raw. I'll cancel everything. The merger, the international expansion, all of it. None of it matters. Victoria laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. Now you'll cancel everything, now that she might die. Where was this clarity this morning when I was calling you terrified and alone? She turned to face him fully, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger, but a cold final assessment. You know what the worst part is, Christopher? I've been making excuses for you for 2 years. Every missed dinner, every forgotten anniversary, every time you prioritized a conference call over our life together. I told myself you were building something for our family, for our future. You were right, he interjected desperately. That's exactly what I was doing. No, she shook her head slowly. You were feeding your ego. You were proving something to yourself. Maybe to your father who never thought you'd amount to anything. Maybe to those Harvard classmates who didn't take you seriously. But you weren't building anything for us. You were building a monument to yourself, and I was just supposed to stand in its shadow and smile. Before Christopher could respond, a commotion erupted near the NICU entrance. A woman's voice, loud and insistent, carried across the unit. I don't care about your visiting hours. That's my son in there, and I have every right. Christopher's mother, Diane Sterling, swept into the unit like a force of nature, her designer coat billowing behind her. She'd always had impeccable timing for dramatic entrances, but this was beyond even her usual flair for spectacle. Behind her, looking apologetic, was Marcus, who must have called her with the news. Christopher, darling, I came as soon as I heard. Diane's voice softened only marginally as she approached, her sharp eyes taking in Victoria's pallor, the incubator, the medical equipment. This is absolutely dreadful. Have you spoken to the board? They'll need to know you'll be absent for, well, however long this takes. Mother, not now, Christopher said through gritted teeth. But Diane was already at the incubator, peering at Grace with the clinical interest of someone examining a problematic investment. She's quite small, isn't she? The doctors are confident she'll pull through? Mrs. Sterling, Victoria's voice cut like ice, your granddaughter has a 60% chance of survival. If you can't offer support, I'd appreciate if you'd leave. Diane's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose. I'm simply being realistic, dear. Someone has to think about the practical implications. Christopher has responsibilities, obligations that can't simply be abandoned because... Get out. Victoria stood swaying slightly, but her voice never wavered. Get out now, or I'll have security remove you. For perhaps the first time in her life, Diane Sterling found herself speechless. She looked to her son for support, but Christopher had moved to Victoria's side, his arm around her waist, steadying her. You heard her mother leave. After Diane departed in a huff of indignation and expensive perfume, Victoria allowed herself to lean against Christopher just for a moment. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation evaporated, leaving her trembling. I'm sorry, Christopher whispered into her hair. I'm sorry for all of it. My mother, my choices, my blindness to what matters. Victoria pulled away gently. I need you to understand something, Christopher. An apology isn't enough. Sorry doesn't keep our daughter alive. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that I went through labor alone, terrified, calling for you while you ignored every attempt I made to reach you. A nurse approached, tactfully interrupting. "Mrs. Sterling, you should return to your room and rest. You've been through major surgery and you need to recover your strength. We'll call you immediately if there's any change in Grace's condition." Victoria nodded, but as the nurse wheeled her toward the door, she looked back at Christopher. "You can stay with her. That's what fathers do, they show up." The words landed like a physical blow, and Christopher sank into the chair beside Grace's incubator as Victoria disappeared down the corridor. Alone with his daughter for the first time, he studied her tiny face, searching for traces of himself, of Victoria, of the family they were supposed to become. "I'm here now," he whispered, pressing his hand against the clear plastic that separated them. "I know I'm late, and I know I've already failed you in ways I might never be able to fix, but I'm here now, Grace. Please fight. Please give me a chance to be the father you deserve." The hours crawled by. Christopher refused to leave, even when Marcus arrived with changes of clothes and urgent documents requiring signatures. He signed them without reading them, his eyes never leaving Grace's monitors, learning to interpret every beep, every fluctuation in the numbers that represented his daughter's tenuous hold on life. At 3 in the morning, as Christopher dozed in the uncomfortable chair, an alarm suddenly pierced the quiet. Grace's oxygen saturation was dropping, the numbers falling rapidly. Within seconds, the NICU exploded into controlled chaos as doctors and nurses surrounded the incubator. Christopher was pushed back, forced to watch helplessly as they worked on his daughter. He saw Dr. Morrison's hands moving with practiced precision, heard the urgent exchanges of medical terminology he didn't understand, and felt his heart stop with every passing second. "Come on, Grace," Dr. Morrison urged, adjusting the ventilator settings. "Come on, sweetheart. Fight." Victoria appeared at Christopher's side, somehow having sensed the crisis even from her room. She was crying silently, her hand finding his and gripping with desperate strength. For 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours, they stood together, united in terror and helpless love. Then, gradually, the numbers began to climb. Grace's oxygen saturation stabilized, then improved. The frantic energy in the room shifted, softened. Dr. Morrison stepped back from the incubator, her shoulders dropping with relief. "She's stable," the doctor announced, and Christopher felt Victoria collapse against him. But as the medical team dispersed and the crisis passed, Dr. Morrison pulled them aside. Her expression was strange, caught between professional concern and something that looked almost like wonder. "I need to tell you something unusual," she began. "When Grace's levels dropped, her heart rate simultaneously spiked in a pattern I've never seen before. It was almost as if she was fighting with intention, with determination. I've been doing this for 23 years, and I've never seen a premature infant show that kind of willfulness." Victoria's hand tightened on Christopher's. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dr. Morrison smiled slightly, "that your daughter is a fighter. That crisis should have gone much worse, but she rallied. She chose to stay." The doctor paused, then added, "There's something else. I'm going to run some additional tests, but I think Grace's condition may be improving faster than we initially predicted. I don't want to give you false hope. But that episode, as terrifying as it was, showed me that she's stronger than her size suggests." After Dr. Morrison left, Christopher and Victoria stood together at Grace's incubator. The silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid, everything broken, everything that might still be saved. "I filed for divorce," Victoria said suddenly, her voice barely audible. 3 weeks ago, the papers are being prepared by my attorney." Christopher's world tilted. "What?" "I couldn't do it anymore, Christopher. The loneliness, the feeling of being a widow to your ambition. I was going to tell you after the baby was born, give you one last chance to be present for something that mattered." She laughed sadly. "I guess I got my answer about where your priorities lie." "Victoria, please." "But now," she interrupted, looking at Grace, "now we have her to think about. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to prove that what happened tonight changed you, not with words, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, with action, with presence, with showing up every single day for her and for us." She finally looked at him, and in her eyes he saw both the end of their old life and the possibility of something new. "You get one chance, Christopher. One. Grace is giving us a gift by fighting to survive. Don't waste it." The first rays of dawn filtered through the NICU windows, painting Grace's incubator in soft gold. Christopher hadn't moved from his position beside her, his hand still pressed against the plastic barrier, as if his physical presence could somehow anchor her to life. Victoria had returned to her room an hour earlier, exhausted from surgery and emotion, but not before extracting a promise from him. When she wakes up, when, not if, I want you here, she'd said. I want her first memory of this world to include her father. Now, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, Christopher made silent promises. He would be different. He would be better. He would be present. The words felt hollow even in his own mind, worn smooth by repetition. But this time something fundamental had shifted inside him. His phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. Board meeting in 3 hours. Tanaka delegation expects your attendance. Critical discussions about implementation timeline. Christopher stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a response he never thought he'd send. Cancel everything for the next month. Reassign the Tanaka project to Davidson. I'm taking family leave effective immediately. The reply came quickly. Sir, are you certain? This could jeopardize. I'm certain, Christopher typed. Some things matter more than money. Dr. Morrison arrived at 7 a.m. for rounds, her face brightening when she saw the latest monitoring data. This is remarkable, she murmured, adjusting her reading glasses to peer at the screens. Grace's oxygen levels have improved by 12% overnight. Her lung function is responding better than expected to the medication protocol. What does that mean? Christopher asked, afraid to hope. It means, Dr. Morrison smiled, that your daughter is exceeding our expectations. If this trajectory continues, we might be able to reduce her ventilator support in the next 48 hours. She's not out of danger yet, but she's fighting her way back. Christopher felt tears stream down his face, the first time he'd cried since his father's funeral 15 years ago. Is there any way I can touch her? Hold her hand? Dr. Morrison considered, then nodded. Through the portals, yes. Let me show you. She guided his hands through the circular openings in the incubator, and for the first time, Christopher's finger touched his daughter's palm. Grace's hand, impossibly tiny, reflexively curled around his finger with a grip that felt surprisingly strong. In that moment, something inside Christopher that had been locked away for years cracked open completely. Hello, Grace, he whispered. I'm your daddy. I'm so sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. But I'm here now and I'm never leaving you again. Victoria appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a nurse's arm. Against medical advice, she'd insisted on coming to the NICU. When she saw Christopher with his finger wrapped in Grace's tiny hand, his face wet with tears, something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. She's improving, Christopher said, looking up at Victoria. Dr. Morrison says she's exceeding expectations. Victoria moved to the other side of the incubator, carefully positioning herself in the chair the nurse provided. She reached through the opposite portal, stroking Grace's leg with gentle fingers. She's a sterling, Victoria said softly. Stubborn as they come. She gets that from both of us. They sat together in silence, both connected to their daughter through touch, the first moment of peace they'd shared in months. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Grace's chest rose and fell, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the crisis began to transform into something that looked like hope. Over the next 5 days, Grace's improvement continued to astonish the medical team. Her lung function strengthened, her oxygen levels stabilized, and on the 6th day, Dr. Morrison removed the ventilator, replacing it with a less invasive breathing support system. Grace's first unassisted breath made both her parents cry. Christopher had moved into Victoria's hospital room, sleeping on the uncomfortable couch, refusing to return to their penthouse. He attended every medical consultation, learned every detail of Grace's care, and spent hours each day at her incubator, talking to her, reading to her, playing soft classical music that the nurses said might help her development. The Sterling Industries Board sent increasingly urgent messages. The Tanaka delegation was threatening to walk away from the merger. Stock prices were fluctuating. Shareholders were demanding answers. Christopher deleted each message without reading beyond the first line. On the 8th day, as Victoria sat beside Grace's incubator, Christopher entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and an envelope. He looked nervous, uncertain, emotions Victoria had rarely seen him display. I need to show you something, he said, handing her the envelope. Inside were legal documents. Victoria's hands trembled as she read them, once then twice, making sure she understood correctly. You're stepping down as CEO, she whispered. Effective in 3 months, yes. I'll transition to chairman of the board, a position that requires maybe 10 hours a week instead of 80. I've already identified my successor, someone I trust completely. Christopher pulled up a chair beside her. I'm also selling my majority stake in the company. Not all of it, but enough that we'll never have to worry about money, and I'll never have to sacrifice our family for a quarterly earnings report. Victoria stared at him, searching his face for signs of resentment or martyrdom, but found only calm certainty. "The papers," she said carefully. "The divorce papers. My attorney has them ready, I know." "Christopher, you can't make this grand gesture and expect everything to be fine. What you did, missing those calls, not being there, that's not something I can just forgive because you're making changes now." "I know that too," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forget or forgive. I'm asking for a chance to earn back your trust. However long that takes, months, years, I'll wait." He looked at Grace, his expression tender. "She deserves to grow up with both her parents if possible, and I want to be the kind of man worthy of being her father." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Part of her wanted to sign those papers, to make a clean break from the man who'd hurt her so deeply. But another part, the part that had fallen in love with Christopher Sterling 10 years ago, that had believed in him, that had seen glimpses of who he could be, that part whispered that everyone deserved a second chance. "I'm not signing them," she said finally. "Not yet. But I'm not tearing them up either. You have 1 year, Christopher. 1 year to prove that this isn't just guilt-talking. 1 year to show me that you've actually changed." Relief flooded Christopher's face, but he nodded solemnly. 1 year. I'll prove it every single day. 3 weeks later, Grace Sterling was discharged from the hospital. At 6 pounds, 2 ounces, still small but healthy, she came home to the penthouse that Christopher had transformed. The master bedroom had been converted into a nursery suite, allowing Victoria to be close to Grace at all times. He'd hired a night nurse, not to replace them, but to ensure they both got adequate sleep. Most surprisingly, he'd enrolled in parenting classes and had certificates to prove it. The first night home, as Victoria nursed Grace in the rocking chair Christopher had bought, he sat on the floor nearby, watching them with an expression of wonder. "I missed so much," he said softly. "The pregnancy, the preparation, all those moments I can never get back." "No, you can't," Victoria agreed, her voice gentle but honest. "But you're here for this moment. That's what matters now." 6 months passed. Christopher kept his word with a dedication that slowly began to erode Victoria's defenses. He was there for every pediatrician appointment, every late-night feeding, every first milestone. He'd traded his suits for casual clothes, his office for the nursery, his business dinners for family meals. The transition at Sterling Industries proceeded smoothly, and Christopher discovered that letting go of control brought unexpected freedom. Grace thrived, her early struggles leaving no lasting impact. She was a happy baby with Christopher's dark eyes and Victoria's smile, and she clearly adored her father, lighting up whenever he entered the room. One evening, as they watched Grace attempt to crawl across the living room floor, Victoria reached for Christopher's hand. The gesture was tentative, testing, but he accepted it carefully, as if holding something precious and fragile. "I've been thinking," Victoria said, "about those divorce papers." Christopher's body tensed, but he didn't speak, waiting. "I burned them last week," she continued. "I know I said 1 year, but I've seen enough. You've shown up every day, Christopher. Not just physically, but emotionally. You've become the partner I needed, the father Grace deserves." "Victoria," his voice caught. "But," she interrupted, squeezing his hand, "I need you to understand that trust isn't just rebuilt, it's continuously maintained. One backslide, one merger that becomes more important than us, and we're done. No second chances after this." "I understand," Christopher said, pulling her close, "and I promise you, I'm done chasing things that don't matter. I spent years building an empire, and I almost lost everything that actually mattered. I won't make that mistake again." Grace chose that moment to successfully propel herself forward 3 feet, her face exploding with pride at her accomplishment. Both parents cheered, their laughter mingling as they celebrated their daughter's achievement. That night, after Grace was asleep, Christopher and Victoria stood together in the nursery doorway, watching their daughter's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, a sight that would never stop feeling miraculous, given how close they'd come to losing her. "I've been offered a position," Victoria said quietly, "teaching art history at Columbia. Part-time, flexible hours. I'd really like to take it." "You should," Christopher said immediately. "You gave up so much for me. For us. It's time you had something that's yours again." Victoria leaned against him, finally allowing herself to fully trust in this new version of their life. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Better than okay, Christopher promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. We're going to be happy. 2 years later, the Sterling family stood on the beach in front of their new home in Martha's Vineyard. Christopher had sold the penthouse, too full of painful memories, and bought this house where Grace could grow up with sand between her toes and the ocean as her playground. He'd opened a small venture capital firm, focused on sustainable technologies, working from home and investing in companies that prioritized people over profits. Grace, now 2.5, squealed with delight as small waves washed over her feet, her dark curls bouncing as she jumped. Victoria, pregnant with their second child, this time with Christopher present for every appointment, every ultrasound, every kick, laughed at their daughter's joy. "Again, Daddy!" Grace demanded, and Christopher swept her up, spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter. Looking at them, Victoria felt a peace she'd thought was lost forever. The road back had been long, built on daily choices and consistent action rather than grand gestures. But they'd made it, transformed by crisis into something stronger than they'd been before. That night, as they tucked Grace into bed, she looked up at her father with serious eyes. "Daddy, did you know I was very tiny when I was born?" "I did know that," Christopher said, smoothing her hair. "You were the tiniest, bravest baby in the whole world." "And you were there?" Grace asked, a question she'd posed many times, as if confirming an important truth. "I was there," Christopher confirmed, the lie by omission one he and Victoria had agreed upon. Grace would learn the full truth someday, when she was old enough to understand, but for now, she deserved to believe her father had always been present. "And I'll always be there, sweet girl, always." After Grace fell asleep, Christopher found Victoria on the porch, watching the moonlight dance on the waves. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her growing belly. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Victoria thought about the divorce papers she'd burned, about the year of careful rebuilding, about the man Christopher had become versus the man he'd been. She thought about Grace, sleeping peacefully upstairs, and the new life growing inside her. "No regrets," she confirmed. "You kept your promise. You showed up." And in the end, Victoria realized, that's what love truly was. Not the grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the daily choice to be present, to prioritize what mattered, to show up even when it was difficult. Christopher had learned that lesson at nearly too high a cost, but he'd learned it completely. As they stood together watching the waves, Grace safe in her bed and their new baby moving beneath Victoria's heart, the Sterling family had finally found what had been missing all along. Not success or wealth or status, but simply each other, present and whole, and finally, truly home.